Bethany Decker was a 21-year-old university student who lived in Ashburn, Virginia. Bethany was described as always upbeat and smiling. She had 2 younger sisters. She was studying global and economic change at George Mason University. During her time at GMU, she got pregnant by Army National Guardsman Emil Decker. They married in 2009, and 6 months after the couple's wedding, their son was born. Emil was often deployed to Afghanistan with his unit for months at a time. During those times, the boy was frequently left with Bethany's in-laws in Columbia, Maryland, so that she could work and attend classes. Bethany started a part-time job in a restaurant for extra income. Emil was soon to leave for Afghanistan for a long period, and this was a difficult time for Bethany. At this point, the couple decided to take a break. Bethany met a Bolivian immigrant named Ronald Roldan in the restaurant and started a romantic relationship with him. She told her mother that she was feeling lonely because Emil has been overseas for a long time. Bethany's best friend was shocked when she discovered that Ronald had moved into Bethany's apartment. Sarah warned her about it, but Bethany did whatever she wanted. Communication between Emil and Bethany was waning, and Emil noticed that something was going on. Emil tried to communicate with her but was unsuccessful. Things started changing between Bethany and Ronald. Ronald became a controlling and abusive partner. Bethany's mother Kim was frightened after hearing about what was going on in Bethany's life. She suspected that Ronald had hurt Bethany's son Kai, which is why he was scared of Ronald and had a black eye on one occasion. Ronald also tried to approach the daycare where Kim was and pretend that he was Emil. Fortunately, the daycare staff realized that something was wrong, and nothing bad happened. Ronald started calling and texting Bethany even when she was at work, asking where she was and who she was with. She was pregnant again, and this time, the father was Ronald. Bethany was in a very bad situation and decided to tell everything to Emil. Bethany told Emil that she had made a mistake. Emil was a devoted father and tried to make things better. They spent the holidays together in Hawaii. Bethany wanted to kick Ronald out of the apartment or leave the apartment herself secretly. She and her mother began developing a plan to get her out of the relationship. On January 28, 2011, Bethany and Emil came back from vacation and spent the night at her grandparents' home. Bethany confided to her grandmother that she was drowning in stress and guilt. She said that she made a mistake by leaving Emil and choosing Ronald. The next morning, Emil saw Bethany before she returned to the flat in Ashburn. Later that day, Roldan claimed to have seen her there, but she has not been seen since. The last time Bethany spoke to anyone besides Emil or Roldan was when she called her workplace that day to check her work schedule for the upcoming week. On February 2nd, Emil arrived at the airport hoping to see Bethany there, but she didn't come. He called Bethany, but she didn't respond. Emil also called her restaurant, but they said she hadn't been at work for the last few days. He called her family and said something was wrong. Sarah, Bethany's friend, logged into her Facebook account and saw Bethany was online. Sarah immediately sent her messages via Messenger, but the replies were misspelled and the English were broken. Sarah knew it wasn't Bethany. Emil also got an email in poor English from Bethany's email address. Bethany's accounts had been hacked. Decker's grandmother visited her apartment, but no one was there. On February 19, her mother called 911 to report Bethany missing. Authorities moved quickly because they had already lost a lot of time. According to investigators, Decker had not used her bank accounts or phone since the day she was last seen, nor had she reported to work or attended her class. Police focused on Emil and Roldan since both might have had a motive to hurt Bethany due to their love triangle they were involved in. With the help of CID, they were able to contact Emil. The police were able to get him back to the United States and he took a polygraph test. Roldan left Bethany's apartment and started living with his mother in Centerville. When he was asked about Bethany being missing, he informed investigators that he had simply believed that she had returned to live with her family. Ronald was the last person who saw Bethany alive. He became a person of interest to the police. But there was nothing that could link him to Bethany's case. A search warrant was issued for Ronald's apartment, but nothing was found. His phone, computer, and hard drives were all seized. Months turned into years, but no trace of Bethany could be found. In November 2014, a woman named Vicky called 911 and said she had shot her boyfriend twice when he attacked her. and her boyfriend was Roldan. Vicky drew a revolver that she had hidden in the living room. Roldan continued to struggle, but she was able to shoot him twice. Eventually, he was able to take control of the gun and shoot her 3 times, once in the head. Vicky's head injury caused her to lose an eye. Because detectives thought she had been acting in self-defense, she was not charged. As the inquiry continued, Roldan moved to North Carolina, and there, in 2016, he was found guilty of criminal assault with the intent to kill his new girlfriend and received a 6-year prison term. The Loudoun County Sheriff's Office acquired a warrant for Roldan's arrest for Decker's kidnapping on November 9, 2020. After serving his sentence in North Carolina, LCSO brought him back to Loudoun County. In connection with Decker's disappearance, Roldan pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on November 17, 2022. Roldan agreed to meet with the county's prosecutors and investigators to explain what happened as part of a plea deal. Roldan claims that he got into a fight with Bethany about her returning to work for another shift. Her head hit a windowsill when he pushed her in the back. She fell to the ground, unresponsive. He claimed that she wasn't breathing. Instead of dialing 911 or attempting to revive her, Roldan threw her body in the nearby trash compactor after wrapping it in a large plastic bag provided by their Ashburn apartment community for the disposal of Christmas trees. Roldan received the maximum penalty of 40 years in jail, with the exception of 12 years and 6 months. If Roldan violates any other terms, such as being prohibited from contacting Decker's family members, or commits another crime while his sentence is suspended for 25 years, he could be forced to serve the entire term. On November 17, 1978, a person cutting firewood near Lake of the Woods came across 2 dead bodies, a young man and woman. Both had been shot to death. Carl Burkhart, then a detective with the Klamath County Sheriff's Office, arrived at the scene soon after. The future Klamath County Sheriff gathered with fellow deputies. Investigators soon identified the first body as Kirk Leonard Wiseman, 19. The second was identified as Cynthia Lynn Frayer, 17. An autopsy indicated Frayer had been sexually assaulted. Both victims had been shot in the head several times with a .22 caliber firearm. Neither had a connection to the Klamath area. Former Klamath Falls Chief of Police Dan Tefel was also a deputy dispatched to the scene. More than 43 years later, he still can't forget it. It was a very gruesome scene, Tefel said on Thursday. It's not every day you find 2 young people killed in the way they were. I still remember it vividly. I can still picture it. Tefel said that November 17, 1978, was a cold day that led into a colder night. Law enforcement at the scene tried to figure out how such a heinous crime, which appeared to be an abduction and murder by a stranger, could occur in Klamath County. You could tell that whoever did it didn't have much respect for human life, the way the bodies were disposed, he said. It seemed like it was a very callous murder. Burkhart was determined to find out who killed those 2 kids. He worked the case from the moment he laid eyes on the victims' bodies until he retired as sheriff in 2001. Deputies determined that Wiseman and Frayer had been hitchhiking through the area. One of the few items recovered from the scene was a sign that read K Falls. Police determined the teens had stayed a night at a motel in Roseburg and had been picked up by a person who claimed to have dropped them off at a Grants Pass restaurant. They found a letter written by Frayer, addressed to her mother, which mentioned the fun they had in Washington state. That was all the information police had. Over those decades, the case remained unsolved, and without many leads. The original evidence bags from 1978 remained locked away in storage, with Burkhart returning to them from time to time, hoping to notice some clue he hadn't seen before. But what Burkhart and the other investigators on the case couldn't have known is how important that evidence, bagged and preserved, would prove to be nearly 4 decades later. By 2011, the case had been turned over to Detective Nick Kennedy. Kennedy rolled up his sleeves and started going through it with fresh eyes, looking for anything that could potentially be analyzed for DNA. DNA was a tool that didn't exist for law enforcement back in 1978, and the technology was becoming better every decade. Where Kennedy left off, Detective Geneva Lewis pushed forward. She sent a few items of Cynthia's clothing to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab in Bend for analysis. From 2011 through 2018, little DNA was found on the items, by then more than 30 years old. In 2019, the puzzling case landed on Detective Dan Towery's desk. That spring, Towery got a call from Devin Mast in the crime lab. "We got something," Mast told Towery. The cold case was suddenly hot. Unknown male number 1. Mast had sent samples to another lab in Portland to check their authenticity. Both had confirmed the presence of DNA from an unknown male number 1. It wasn't much of a breakthrough, but it was the first one police had in decades. The DNA sample was then entered into the Combined DNA Index System, a nationwide database of DNA samples. There were no hits. But Towery had earned himself the nickname among his peers of Hound Dog, a nod to his persistence as an investigator. He kept on the trail. Towery knew of an expensive, private facility in Virginia called Parabon Nanolabs that might be able to help identify unknown male number 1. Towery needed funds to tackle the work, so he sent an email to Klamath County Sheriff Chris Caber. Caber said he wasn't confident about using an expensive private lab to possibly get information on a case that had been so cold for so long. But Towery was persistent and eventually swayed Caber to give the green light. The testing cost around $8,000, which Towery and Caber said was a small price to pay if it would bring peace to the families of the victims. The lab, which helped solve the Golden State Killer case from the same era, would lend a hand. According to the lab, it uses genetic genealogy to predict the unknown person's ancestry, then produce a composite sketch and/or perform kinship analysis to advance the investigation. The lab used the DNA sample and the genealogical information from it to identify unknown male number 1. In the summer of 2021, Parabon told Klamath County detectives they had a viable suspect, Ray Whitson, Jr. Parabon said that, because of Whitson Jr.'s DNA found on Frayer's body, he almost assuredly killed both Wiseman and Frayer. Police then tried to locate Whitson, but they quickly learned that the man, who had worked at a Klamath area lumber mill in the 1970s, had died in Texas in 1996. He had no criminal history. Towery was, however, able to confirm Parabon's conclusion. He met with and retrieved DNA samples from 2 of Whitson's living children. His investigation also started checking off all boxes related to the facts of the case. For example, Whitson's family members were able to confirm he carried a .22 caliber pistol with him, the same caliber used in the double murder. The area where the murders took place was also known to be frequented by Whitson. Once confident with the findings, a report was submitted to Klamath County District Attorney Eve Costello for review. Costello said she determined the evidence would be strong enough to prosecute Whitson if he were alive today. At that point, based on our suspect Mr. Whitson being deceased, we have suspended the case at this time, based on his DNA being on the female victim's body, Towery said Thursday. For law enforcement's perspective, the county's longest unsolved murder case has been closed. If we had been just 10, 15 years earlier, we would have been able to hold that individual accountable in a way that we now cannot do, said Costello, tears welling in her eyes. What we have been able to do is bring closure for a family, because when somebody dies and you don't know really what happened, you just know they left this universe in really awful way. It leaves with you a really huge, hollow feeling. This work has allowed that family to have some degree of peace. Towery remembered the letter written by Frayer, which was recovered and kept in evidence all these years. It was addressed to the victims' parents, and it recounted the couple's adventures in Washington, and expressed their hopes and dreams. It, along with a pair of Frayer's earrings, will be returned to the victim's mother and aunt as a symbol of closure. Towery said closing this case brings him peace and closure, too. I would love to say this is just another case, Towery said, with emotion in his voice. But it's not. California deputies came for Philip Lee Wilson 40 years to the day after he allegedly raped and murdered Robin Gisela Brooks in her Sacramento apartment. On Wednesday, March 9, 2022, which was Wilson's 73rd birthday, a Sacramento County jury found him guilty of Brooks' murder, with the special circumstances because it occurred in the course of a sexual assault. He faced life in prison. Brooks, 20, was found raped and stabbed to death in her bedroom April 24, 1980. After she failed to show up for work at a donut shop. Co-workers who went to check on her found her body. Brooks' family and friends were elated after the verdict, as were detectives who worked on the long cold case. The murder was solved in 2020 with the aid of genetic genealogy. There is justice in the world, and he will spend all his birthdays now in prison, retired Sacramento County Detective Mickey Lynx told ABC 10 after the verdict. I wish we found him earlier, but finally, justice has been done. Brooks' sister, Maria Eric, broke down in tears as she was embraced outside the courtroom. I feel like I can go on with my life now, Eric told the news station. I think the case absorbed a piece of who I was. She said the resolution of her sister's murder gives her hope for other families. I feel good that this gives other people hope in the future that justice can be served, even after 42 years, Eric said. Jurors returned with a guilty verdict one day after telling the judge they were deadlocked. At that point, 6 of the 12 jurors were unconvinced that Wilson was responsible for murdering Brooks, according to the Sacramento Bee. Deliberations continued, however, and they convicted him the following day. The Bee reported that Wilson sat quietly at the defense table, his head in his hands. During the trial, the defense argued that Wilson had consensual sex with Brooks but left her alive and well in her home, the newspaper reported. That argument contradicted Wilson's initial claim to detectives that he had never met Brooks or been to her apartment. Assistant Public Defender Thomas Klinkenbeard pointed blame for the murder at Norbert Holston, who was dating Eric at the time of her sister's slaying. Holston, who has since died, had a tense relationship with Brooks. Brooks followed her sister to the West Coast, moving to Sacramento from Highland, New York, just 6 months before her death. According to authorities, she had worked her late shift at donut time, leaving just after midnight on April 24, 1980. She was joking about having to go home and make her bed before she could crawl into it, co-worker Joan Olson told the Bee in 1980. She had stripped the bed and done the laundry before she came to work, and she was joking about how it wasn't fair to have to make a bed at bedtime. Brooks, who did not have a car, walked the block to the Garden Club apartments, where she had been living for 6 weeks. She made it home to her unit but never made it to bed, authorities said. Brooks was found face down on her waterbed in a pool of bloody water. The bed's mattress had been punctured by the knife that killed her. She had been stabbed 5 times, including a wound that pierced her heart. Brooks' killer had left his semen in her body and his fingerprints on the windowsill. Smears of his blood were found on the walls of the apartment. The suspect apparently cut himself during the assault, and his DNA profile has been uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System (CODIS) database, authorities previously said. To this date, no match has been made. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne-Marie Schubert said in 2020, when Wilson was arrested, that the first ray of hope in the case came in 2004, when the county crime lab was able to develop a DNA profile of the killer. The case stayed cold for several more years. You're not going to get away with this, Lynx said. I'm going to do whatever I can to find you and make you pay for what you did. The real break in the case came in 2017, when Sacramento County Sheriff's Office investigators teamed with Parabon Nanolabs. The Virginia-based lab offers forensic genealogy services, as well as a product called Snapshot, which uses DNA phenotyping to predict an unknown person's ancestry and physical appearance. Detectives released the images created by Parabon, but they still had no luck tracking Brooks' killer. In 2018, genetic genealogy burst onto the scene as California authorities used the technique to identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the infamous Golden State Killer, who was responsible for a long string of rapes and murders beginning in the 1970s. Investigators were able to use the technique to build a family tree for Brooks' killer and eventually zero in on Wilson. Wilson's DNA matched the profile of the blood found on Brooks' apartment walls. He also left behind fingerprints, authorities said. The Bee reported that at the time of Brooks' death, Wilson, then 31, lived in a rental home on Happy Lane, less than 2 miles from where Brooks was murdered. He lived in North Sacramento in 2020, when he was arrested. Prosecutors said that Wilson's DNA also matched evidence in a rape that occurred 3 weeks before the murder, according to the newspaper. Philip Wilson was and is a charismatic man, Deputy District Attorney Timothy Carr told jurors. He is eloquent. He has friends. But he is also, as the evidence in this case shows, a man with a proclivity to commit monstrous acts. He is broken and has always been broken. Carr said Brooks was killed in the most painful, grotesque way imaginable. Wilson killed her likely both to fulfill a sick fantasy, but also to get away with it, to eliminate the one witness who could have stood there and told what he did that night, the prosecutor said. Klinkenbeard, in pointing the finger at the deceased Holston, told jurors that Eric had described Holston in 1980 as a wacko who had confessed to previously breaking into Brooks' apartment. At trial, however, Brooks testified that she is a light sleeper and that she would have noticed if Holston, who was with her, had left the morning of the murder. The defense attorney said Eric's testimony was understandable, the Bee reported. It would be a terrible thing to think that your boyfriend killed your sister, but that is what she thought at the time, Klinkenbeard said. Lesia Mitchell Jackson was kidnapped, sexually assaulted and murdered in 1979. Her killer was executed more than 20 years later for another murder. Family members of a girl found dead in Montgomery County more than 4 decades ago finally know who killed her. 12-year-old Lesia Mitchell Jackson disappeared from her neighborhood off of FM 1485 after spending a day at a community pool. A week later, on September 13, 1979, an oilfield worker found her body in a heavily wooded area along a pipeline near Exxon Road in Conroe. An autopsy revealed Lesia had been sexually assaulted before she was murdered, according to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Despite an extensive investigation that lasted for years, the case eventually went cold. In 2005, MCSO created the Cold Case Homicide Squad and they took over the investigation. Last October, detectives from the unit sent DNA from Lesia's clothing to Texas DPS forensic scientists who used a new technology called MVAC to develop a DNA profile. They got a hit on the FBI's CODIS database that identified Lesia's killer as Gerald Dwight Casey. Further investigation revealed Casey had been executed in 2002 for another murder. MCSO says this is the oldest cold case ever solved by their department and they credit tenacity, diligence, and a dedicated team. Casey, 34, and his accomplice, 36-year-old Carla Smith, cooked up a plan in 1989 to steal a bunch of guns from a man they knew so they could sell them and use the money to move to Florida. On July 10, they discovered Darrell Pennington, the owner of the guns, was at work and his roommate, Sonia Lynn Howell, was home alone. Smith later testified that she and Casey agreed that they would leave Howell in the woods so Pennington would think she stole the guns. Instead, the victim was beaten with a telephone, shot 9 times and dumped in the woods. Witnesses later identified Casey as the person who sold them guns stolen from Pennington. Smith testified against Casey at his 1991 trial and he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Even before Howell's murder, Casey had a long rap sheet that included assaulting a police officer, burglary, and multiple drug charges. He'd spent time in and out of prison between 1976 and 1989. Casey was 47 when he was executed by lethal injection on April 18, 2002. Smith was convicted of robbery for her role in the case and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Joseph Todd Jowers was 32 years old when he was shot and killed outside of the now defunct nightclub where he often taught line dancing and sang karaoke in October 1996. Now, over 26 years later, Alabama law enforcement say they have finally found his killer. During the early morning hours of October 13, 1996, Jowers walked a woman to her car in the parking lot of what was then the Classics Lounge on 37th Street East in Tuscaloosa. By 2:20 a.m. he was shot in the head. The woman was never able to describe the assailant. No arrests were ever made at the time and eventually the case went cold. The case had some leads, but those went nowhere for decades. In October 2020, the Tuscaloosa Police Department formally reopened the case, sending out a call to the public for help. On December 23, 2022, the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office announced the arrest of Thomas Terry Johnson Jr., 49, on charges of murder. TCSO Captain Jack Kennedy said for the past year, investigators with the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office's Violent Crimes Unit worked diligently, re-evaluated evidence, located numerous persons who were determined to be witnesses to the original case, and then presented their findings to a grand jury. Details on the case are currently scarce. Investigators did not offer information as to how the particular suspect was connected to Jowers' murder or otherwise provide evidence to make their case publicly. Police did say the suspect may have hidden in bushes near the nightclub and escaped through a wooded area in the southern part of the parking lot. A Patch.com feature on the case in October 2021 recounted a news story written in the immediate aftermath of the slaying written by reporter Wendy Reeves and published by the Tuscaloosa News. In that initial account, Jowers' girlfriend told police she heard a pop and turned to see him on the ground near his car, some 40 to 50 feet away. Another witness at the time said they saw a white man in black clothing, wearing something like a cap, running away and ducking back behind the club after the shooting. A handgun was later recovered from the parking lot of Classics that was believed to have been the murder weapon. In comments reported by various outlets, Kennedy speculated that robbery may have been a potential motive. Jowers also worked as a carpenter and handyman and may have been relieved of cash that may have been in his pockets after the murder. The homicide unit commander of the TPD at the time said he believed that several people witnessed the shooting but were reluctant to come forward. The murder of the popular fixture at the bar, at the time, came during a particularly violent era in Tuscaloosa. Jowers' death was the 9th homicide that year. The since-closed lounge is now occupied by Crimson Bar. More than 26 years passed without an arrest in the shooting death of Joseph Todd Jowers as he left a Tuscaloosa lounge on October 13, 1996. On Thursday, December 22, 2022, authorities said they jailed a suspect in the cold case after a Tuscaloosa County grand jury indicted a 49-year-old man on murder charges. Thomas Terry Johnson Jr., now 49, was taken into custody and jailed on $75,000 bond, Kennedy said. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like the video, and click the bell icon to stay tuned.